Welcome again to Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind. Ongoing series, part 27, Heidegger and Bergson, focusing on Heidegger. So we'll be looking, as a way of looking at Heidegger, at Hubert Dreyfus, the great Hubert Dreyfus, and his class on Heidegger, and a Bergson student, hypothetical, in the aisle. We'll be looking at Heidegger's implication for AI, for Dreyfus. We're looking at the notion of time in Heidegger, his idealistic approach, and the trap he set for himself. And of course, we'll be coming to the throwdown I mentioned earlier on who has the great relevance to science. A little postscript on what we might call strange burials of things within Heidegger, and a postscript on Jason Reza Jorjani and his invocation of Heidegger. So Heidegger's great work, Being and Time, was published in 1927. He was forced to do so, publish or perish, by his department head. He had briefly been studying for the priesthood, a seminarian, for a couple of years. He was a private in World War I and in 1918 for roughly a year. He had been a professor up to this point, teaching for several years at a university in Germany. It's hard to find an expositor who does not think Heidegger was either the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and by extension, Being and Time, the greatest work thereof, or perhaps tied with Wittgenstein for this honor. His great question, being, the nature of being. To quote from his introduction, "For manifestly you have been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understand, have become perplexed." Going on, do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression of being? Not at all. And so is aim. Our aim in the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being, and to do so concretely. Concretely being important. Our provisional aim is the interpretation of time as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. And concreteness we shall see, for it is our everyday concrete world that reflects this being, as it were a mirror, our everyday activity in relation to the concrete world being a mirror that reflects for us the nature of being as what is utterly undefinable otherwise. Being, that is. Now, a caveat. I am not an expert on Heidegger. I have not read all his works. We will not touch all his works. Do not expect that. I am aiming for a critical point of comparison on a critical dimension for our current day. Even here at this deep question of being, where Heidegger begins, there are resonances and differences between Bergson and Heidegger I will neglect. We'll hit them slightly in the postscript. But let us begin. On the net, there's a series of course lectures on Heidegger, given by the great Hubert Dreyfus, author of What Computers Can't Do in 1972, one of the first powerful critiques of the computer model of mind. They were given at UC Berkeley in 2007 and 2008, approximately 55 hours total by my count. In Lecture 1 of fall 2007, the scene that presents itself. The classroom is an auditorium seating at least 160. This is the number that Dreyfus expects to be there. Yet the room is filled to overflowing. People are in the aisles. It is all a bit chaotic. Dreyfus wonders and worries that the regular non-auditing people will not have a syllabus. All these folks have eagerly come to learn about the great Heidegger. Dreyfus unhesitatingly calls him the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. The students are warned they are in for a ride. This is a tough course. Reading 20 pages of Heidegger is like 200 of anyone else. Of all the students there, we can suspect perhaps 0.001% knew of Bergson. For sure, 0.001% understood Bergson. Of course, 1/1000th of, say, 200 students is not a full student. So we'll guess this comprises about 1 cubic centimeter portion of the brain of one of those students. So before the lectures on Heidegger begin, let us imagine what this 1 cubic centimeter knows. The student knew that Bergson had anticipated Denis Gabor's 1947 discovery of holography by 50 years, and the physicist David Bohm's generalization of holography to the universal field itself by 85. Bergson had already posited that the universal field is holographic. And a little picture there shows a field wherein at every point is the photograph of the whole. As Bergson said, the photograph already develops in the very heart of things and at every point of space. Further, he had, in essence, viewed the brain as a form of modulated reconstructive wave passing through this field. And if we look at modulation for a second, we have a hologram plate and we have, shall we say, a set of interference patterns from various sources, objects recorded on that plate. And if we send a reconstructing wave set through that plate, we'll call it frequency 1 is the first set, a wave set of frequency 1. Well, we specify now to the viewer a virtual image of one of the original sources associated with that frequency 1, namely the cube. If we modulate that reconstructive wave to frequency 2, well, now specified a different wave source, an object wave source, in this case, a wine glass, again specified to the viewer in 3 dimensions externally, and modulate the reconstructive wave set to frequency 3. Again, there's a new source specified associated with frequency 3, in this case, the image of the cup as the source of the wave. So in this case then, analogously, we have the brain as the reconstructive wave passing through this holographic field. And the brain then is specific to a source within the field. In this case, say, a coffee cup on the table with spoons stirring away. Thus, Bergson had a true theory of direct perception. That is, the image of the coffee cup is not within the brain. Or as Bergson said, the photograph is not within the brain. The photograph is already developed within the very field itself, the holographic field, and we just have to send a reconstructive wave through this field to specify an original source of some aspect of this field within the field. So what we're seeing is the cup right where it says it is, externally in the field. This is direct perception. Indirect perception is the idea that the image is within the brain, created by the brain, somehow generated by the brain, with many logical attendant problems. In this, Bergson was the necessary complement to J.J. Gibson, who also had a theory of direct perception, where the brain is also specific to the environment, that is responding to, resonating to, as Gibson liked to term it, the mathematical structure, which are invariance laws, defining the events in the environment. But where Bergson's holographic field is required as the natural complement for the intelligibility of the origin of Gibson's image of the environment, the image of the coffee cup. The student also knew this model does not work without Bergson's temporal metaphysic. Bergson had viewed the ever-ongoing transformation of the holographic matter field as indivisible. That is, there are no discrete instants where each present instant falls instantly into the past, that is, into non-existence. Thus, the brain, as a reconstructive wave, can be and is specific to a past portion of the transformation of the field. That is, the indivisible motion of the field defines a primary form of memory, making it necessary to store these ongoing events in some sort of short-term storage areas in the brain, which becomes quickly logically impossible. The brain, via its dynamics, is imposing a scale of time on this field. We normally see a buzzing fly at normal scale. Change the dynamics, change the chemical velocities underlying this dynamics. We might see the fly flapping his wings like a butterfly. The field, via its holographic properties and indivisible transformation, has an elementary awareness defined throughout at the null scale, the most minute possible scale of time. The specification is thus to a time-scaled form of this awareness defined throughout the field. In other words, we're getting rid of the viewer in the holographic reconstructive wave process. There is no viewer in the brain, behind the brain, looking at the source of the wavefronts. No viewer, no homunculus of the image in the brain. Further, he understood, all this underlies Bergson's great principle on the relation of subject and object. Questions of subject and object and their union and distinction must be treated in terms of time, not space, which is to say, in the holographic field, the body and the fly are one field. There's no spatial distinction, no true spatial distinction between the two. The distinction, subject and object, is affected by imposing increasing scales of time upon an aspect of the field. In this case, the fly moves from a, shall we say, ensemble of electrons in the field to ultimately the buzzing fly of normal scale, subjects differentiated from object. And as a selection principle of information from the holographic field is that which relates to bodily action, Bergson termed perception virtual action. That is, the specified image, be it fly, be it cup, reflects how the body can act, and at a specific scale of time, be it buzzing fly or slowly flapping his wings like fly. Again, this would tie precisely to Gibson's notion of affordances. In this elegant model, the student knew Bergson had solved Chalmers' rather misstated hard problem long ago in 1896. For Chalmers had obscured that firstly, the origin of the image of the external world is the problem, not just its qualia, that is, the qualia of the image. And that due to its indivisible transformation, the holographic field is a qualitative field in the first place. So the brain is specific to qualitative events, be it coffee cups and stirring spoons or butterflies, in a qualitative field. As perception is not occurring solely in the brain, experience cannot solely be stored there. Experience of one's canoe trip is not stored within the brain. Thus, Bergson's deep research into the then current memory research on amnesias, aphasias, and his arguments for how memory actually works. The student was aware, too, of Bergson's effort to clarify the misinterpretation and misuse of special relativity and prevent its negative impact on our theory of time, it being the misinterpretation of relativity. But most curiously, he thought out Bergson had in fact laid out a real alternative to the computer model of mind, the very conception Dreyfus had so vigorously critiqued. Yep, in 3 different books, What Computers Can't Do, What Computers Still Can Do, and Mind Over Machine. So Mr. Student stands in his lowly place in the aisle, anticipating the discussion of the great Heidegger. It is a joy to listen to Dreyfus. The interaction with the students is so genuine, so natural. The attempt to dig out the meaning of Heidegger, so sincere, so effortful. I would guess the students loved him. But the effort is a problem with Heidegger. He is so far from direct applicability. If we take as a criterion direct applicability to science, to the brain, perception, memory, cognition, well, there's nothing to do but dig and dig. Yet Dreyfus was an expert in the continental European philosophers, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty. It was their applicability to the surging computer model of mind that he had dug out already in 1972. Actually, his first critique was in 1965, which earned him the hatred of the AI community already then. No one would even have lunch with him, except for Feigenbaum, I believe. And it was with this, then, with which he opened. For Dreyfus, Heidegger was critiquing the possibility of AI before AI. Heidegger was critiquing atomism, the idea that there are independent elements with independent properties. The opposite of atomistic is holistic. And we start coming to the Heideggerian German terms, Vorhandenheit, presence at hand. This describes this atomic way of being, the being of substances, or also current substances. Everything that is self-sufficient is a substance. Tables, cups. This is what Aristotle was interested in describing. It goes through the whole history of philosophy. It gives you a subject and predicate understanding of the same phenomenon. Example, the table, the subject, is brown. Brown being a predicated property. This leads to the predicate calculus, which leads to the formal structure of substances with properties. This then leads to the idea that all you need is the right story of all the substances and all their properties and how they relate logically by formal relations. Now you can describe everything. AI programs, for Dreyfus, are heirs to this presence at hand ontology. For McCarthy, he noted, who was an AI theorist, contemporary at Berkeley with Dreyfus, everything intelligible about the world can be represented in the predicate calculus. This is their quote-unquote ontology. And we noted before, bring it again here, McCarthy had coined the frame problem in 1969. For example, if we're stirring coffee, put the frame problem this way, suppose the cup starts bulging in and out. Is that expected in this event of coffee stirring? And in this case, the robot, to solve this, must check his list of frame axioms. And this is the list of things that do not change. And the difficulty, of course, is this is a massive list, because even the President of the United States doesn't change just because I'm stirring coffee. And the sun doesn't explode because I'm stirring coffee. So we get that list of frame axioms there. For example, one axiom being, it holds that the cup remains the same size as I'm stirring, or that it remains stable as I'm stirring. This is the attempt to represent the world by a form of predicate calculus. So Mr. Robot has got to figure out what's going on there. Is that an unexpected event or not? So substance ontology got turned into a research program by AI. And he says, read H, sometimes I'll have H there for Heidegger. Read Heidegger to see why it didn't work. If things are holistic, it won't work. Our world is not explainable by substance and properties. There is this other way of being, the being of equipment. And the genius of Heidegger was to take the most obvious and simple case. For Heidegger, he uses hammers. A hammer's way of being is such that it could not be a hammer if it weren't for there would be nails and wood and houses and people who have the skills to pound nails into wood. All that has to hang together for something to be a hammer. You can view a Coke bottle, he notes, as a greenish blob, but it misses what it is to be a Coke bottle. Same for a hammer. So just add a property for the AI guys, being for hammering. Now you have absorbed it into the substance ontology, you think. But that leaves out what the hammering is for. Bashing a rock, it's for nails, houses. But this is also a form of normative element. You can make it into a screwdriver for opening a can, but that doesn't make it a screwdriver. It has its place in the entire culture, to the skills of people, to the goals of people. It has an order to hammer nails, a towards which, that is a task, putting these pieces of wood together. It has a final towards which, building a house, and a forsake of which, shelter for mom. And so we have another German word, Zuhandenheit, or readiness to hand, or availableness. Though it would be misleading to think of it as like being in a drawer as readiness to hand. It's not what Heidegger would mean. But this is why AI will fail. Substance property treatment cannot deal with this. It cannot deal with the holism. The whole point of atomism is to be an element in an atomic order. There's also unreadiness to hand, or a mere presence at hand. The hammer could just turn into an object. If too heavy, it's useless. It's no longer truly a hammer. If the head is broken, or something or other. We have a situated holism, in other words, where the object gains its meaning from the situation. Let's return to the distinction, readiness to hand versus presence to hand, a bit later. There's a third way of being, either being equipment nor an object, but rather being a human being. Dreyfus said you'd think philosophers notice this difference. Nope. They talked of humans as different types of substances. So back to the substance property problem. Plato, the soul, is a substance with parts. Descartes, we're thinking substance. Res cogitans, thinking, res extensa, in the world, the extended world. Leibniz, monads, self-sufficient. Kant, the transcendental subject. Husserl, transcendental subjectivity. And Searle, contemporary of Dreyfus, for him, we're all minds. We have mental states, intentional content, that is, what there is that the mind points you towards in the world, to objects in the world. So the coffee cup is intentional content. And mind is self-sufficient, even with no world. In fact, said Dreyfus, this is the criterion. If you can doubt the existence of the external world. Searle would say, well, according to Dreyfus, that's not an interesting question. But, again for Dreyfus, his philosophy allows it. Or as I would say, he's an indirect realist. The image is actually in the brain or in the mind, but we're not sure then whether we're really looking at the world. But as Dreyfus said, we could be brains in a vat for all practical purposes. And for Searle, the substance of mind and the substance of brain are so closely related, for all practical purposes identical, that, well, we still couldn't tell whether we're in the external world or not. In the brain in the vat framework, we hook up a computer to a brain in the vat, send it appropriate signals, sensory signals, and lo and behold, it thinks it's stirring coffee, like Sylvester. So Searle indeed later argued for direct realism, that we're actually seeing the world directly out there. Unfortunately, his theory doesn't escape indirect realism when you look at it. For this, he would need Bergson. And unfortunately, warning down the road, for Heidegger, who doesn't bother with the theory of perception, we're going to see, remarkably, he ends up here anyhow. So what are we? Well, for Heidegger, we are not consciousnesses. We are activity. We give ourselves an identity by taking up a number of practices. We pick up a hammer to build a house for the sake of an understanding of myself as a carpenter, or for Heidegger, taking a stand as a carpenter. So what is this way of being of us? That is Dasein, the name that Heidegger gives to us. Now, da means to point, simply to point in German, or can be there or here. And sein means to be, and Dasein can be roughly translated as being right here or being there. So, what is the way of being of us? That is Dasein, is to take a stand on what it is to be that sort of being. Getting into the very Heideggerian stuff here. We, that is Dasein, by using this equipment in the world, give ourselves an interpretation of what it is to be, back to being, as a human being in that particular culture and this particular human being. Back to the mere reflecting being. The name for this way to be is existence. Only human beings exist, he says. And there's various modes of being. For Handenheit, that is presence at hand, as discussed, makes objects intelligible. Zuhandenheit, readiness to hand, makes equipment intelligible. And Dasein is able to understand existence. That on the basis of which entities are understood, or Haufen, I'm not sure that German word is correct. I couldn't find it. I don't have the original German being and time. Sound for Hauf definitely means toward. It's usually translated towards which, but Dreyfus insists it means on the basis of which. So, just a note. So that on the basis of which entities are understood equals having the above skills to cope with substances, equipment, or ourselves. The student pulls out his crystal ball. There's a 2017 Wiki entry on Dreyfus and AI, some 30 years later. The narrative goes as such. Dreyfus's critique was based on the insights of modern continental philosophers such as Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger. It was directed at the first wave of AI research, which used high-level formal symbols to represent reality and tried to reduce intelligence to symbol manipulation. Now, I had a blast from the past here because in my own doctoral thesis, I treated a schema on events described by Roger Schenck in a book chapter, the chapter titled The Structure of Episodes in Memory. And we have here a schema, C1, with actor 1 and one actor, action propel, object nail, direction wood. A subschema, again one actor, action propel, object hammer, direction nail. So this supposedly described an object hammering, or hammering a nail, propelling a nail, and the nail being propelled into the wood. Now, at this point, looking at this, Heidegger would have had a complete cow and disappeared. And in my own analysis, I was amazed at the utter insufficiency of this with respect to the dynamics, the invariance laws, the forces, the complete lack of specificity that such a schema actually represented. I mean, all you have to do is look at and think about the abstract propel. I can propel a frog into a pond. I can propel a toothbrush. What is propel? How would you ever know what was actually going on? But that's just the beginning of this. In any case, moving on with Wiki's story. Dreyfus argued that human intelligence and expertise does not depend on conscious symbolic manipulation, but rather on unconscious instincts and skills that could never be captured in formal rules. This context or background related to Heidegger's Dasein is a form of knowledge that is not stored in our brain symbolically, but again, stored somehow intuitively in some way. It continues. AI research in general has moved away from high-level symbol manipulation, or GOFI, good old-fashioned AI, towards new models, sub-symbolic models, intended to capture our unconscious reasoning. For example, neural nets, evolutionary algorithms, common sense knowledge research focused on reproducing the background or context of knowledge, or situated robotics, which attempts to capture our unconscious skills at perception and attention. And it notes, Dreyfus himself agrees that these sub-symbolic methods can capture the kind of tendencies and attitudes that he considers essential for intelligence and expertise. These programs simulate the way our unconscious instincts are able to perceive. These programs being deep learning neural nets, evolutionary algorithms. They notice anomalies and make quick judgments, similar to what Dreyfus called sizing up the situation and reacting. But here the situation consists of vast amounts of numerical data. Remember, they're just scraping Wiki text or Google images. So again, anomalies, as they're referring to here, equals the frame problem, equals the deep learning net recognition problem. Again, we have all these instances of a coffee event. Little heart coming out in smoke. All these are instances of coffee event. Remember the robot. Are these expected instances of a coffee event? And yet, the deep learning neural nets are claiming they can recognize coffee stirring events. We'll return to this in a moment. Wiki story continuing. On a fundamental level, they, that is Dreyfus, the early AI folks, spoke a different language. Edward Feigenbaum, a computer scientist, complained, what does he offer us? Phenomenology, that ball of fluff, that cotton candy. Direct assault on Heidegger, who was a phenomenologist. His teacher Husserl being the original phenomenologist. In 1965, there was simply too huge a gap between European philosophy and artificial intelligence, a gap that, wait for it, has since been filled by cognitive science, connectionism, and robotic research. It would take many years before artificial intelligence researchers were able to address the issues that were important to continental philosophy, such as situatedness, embodiment, perception, and gestalt. Going on, Dreyfus did not anticipate that AI researchers would realize their mistake and begin to work towards new solutions, moving away from the symbolic methods that Dreyfus criticized in his substance and property comments, remember. In 1965, he did not imagine that such programs would one day be created, that is, neural nets. So he claimed AI was impossible. In 1965, AI researchers did not imagine that such programs are necessary, so they claimed AI was almost complete. Both were wrong. For a brief period, the student lost consciousness. Coming back to consciousness, he asked, AI has solved common sense knowledge? For the implicit claim here is things like deep learning nets are solving this problem. They are not. Remember, as we talked in number 23, an AI deep learning net could learn through looking at thousands of Google images that these were two cars parked. They classify these appropriately as these images as car parked. But then when seeing an image like this with the car sitting on top of a retaining wall, it would still call that car parked. Or a car floating above the road, car parked. In other words, the difficulty here is that the net has absolutely no concept whatsoever of what it means to park a car. It has a statistical knowledge based on putting a whole bunch of pixels together via weights in its weight matrix. But that's it. It's never parked a car. It has no dynamic understanding of parking a car or driving a car or anything. It's actually dumb as a door. And again, just as our coffee table or coffee event, same difficulty. Again, back to the frame problem, the recognition problem, the common sense knowledge problem. The net would equally have difficulty deciding whether or not these were truly normal coffee events. How would it know? It's never poured coffee. So the problem is far from going away. But the implication in the Wiki story is, oh, it's all going away. Poor Dreyfus. Again, our student asks, AI has a theory of perception, the origin of the image of the external world, which is the origin of experience, which is equally the hard problem. Having no such theory of experience in the first place, it now knows how experience is stored in the brain with no theory of perception. And Dreyfus agrees. And any further worries about Heidegger, therefore, who Dreyfus represents, are now just irrelevant. He just got bulldozed under, both he and Heidegger, that easily. One of Dreyfus's very first statements in the lecture came back. Quote, there were two huge gaps in being and time, perception and the body. Ultimately, Merleau-Ponty would take these gaps, explore and emphasize them. And Dreyfus noted, and Merleau-Ponty is even harder to read than Heidegger. But Merleau-Ponty had no theory of the origin of the image of the external world. With no theory of perception, no theory of the origin of the image of the external world, thus of experience, one has no clue how memory, that is experience, can be stored. And in Bergson's model, perception is not occurring solely within the brain in the first place, therefore experience cannot be stored, particularly solely stored within the brain. An entirely new model of the brain is required. No current conceptions of AI can come close to this. Bergson cannot be bulldozed or simply folded in, as Heidegger was, to AI, or Dreyfus was. He can be ignored, yes. He can be completely misconstrued, yes. Bulldozed, no. Dreyfus neglected the significance of this fatal lack, both in Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, and the phenomenologists in general. None had understood Bergson's holographic model. Just carrying on for a second with this phenomenological theme, Husserl, Heidegger's mentor, is considered the originator of phenomenology. Heidegger's characterization of this method is thus. Thus, phenomenology means to let that which shows itself be seen from itself in the very way in which it shows itself from itself. End quote. Now, whatever this means, and Heidegger indeed spun this out in more detail, but nevertheless, whatever it means, if it means observing the nature of experience, particularly the nature of experienced time, well, maybe it was best that Bergson was rejected from a movement of which he was at the origins. Again, consider his original book, Time and Free Will, in 1889, the subtitle, an essay on the immediate data of consciousness. He was at the origins of the phenomenological approach. And Merleau-Ponty came to regret this exclusion of Bergson from this whole group, shall we say. Quote, if we had been careful readers of Bergson, and if more thought had been given to him, we would have been drawn to a much more concrete philosophy. And that is truly the problem. It is quite certain that Bergson, had we read him carefully, would have taught us things that 10 or 15 years later we believe to be discoveries made by the philosophy of existence itself. Now, this is found in actually the introduction by Michael Kelly in this book on Bergson and Phenomenology and this general problematic relationship itself. But whatever these discoveries were that Merleau-Ponty was thinking of, they had missed the essential point. Bergson had created a concrete alternative model of the brain and mind, concrete, with anchors to science. Yes, an essential form of concreteness, science being where the rubber meets the road in concreteness, or at least should be. Something that phenomenology seemed to deem of small import. But the sounds of the lecture catch the student's attention. More time has passed than he realized. It's now spring 2008. The subject is Division 2 of Being and Time, and this is Heidegger on time. Many Division 1 and Division 2 topics have gone by. For example, Heidegger's discussion of Descartes, spatiality, disposedness, falling, care, truth, guilt and resoluteness, being towards death, anticipatory resoluteness. So of these, we'll have to hammer in, appropriately enough, so to speak, into the student a bit about care, for it is critical to the discussion of time. So a fundamental basis of our being in the world for Heidegger is not matter or spirit, but care. Quote, Dasein's facticity is such that its being in the world always, or has always dispersed itself, or even split itself up into definite ways of being in. The multiplicity of these is indicated by the following examples: having to do something, producing something, attending to something and looking after it, making use of something, giving something up and letting it go, undertaking, accomplishing, evincing, interrogating, considering, discussing, determining. All these ways of being in have concern, as sorga, or care, as their kind of being. Now, William Blattner, and I'll come back to him in a second, notes that 4 things make up this crucial concept: existence, facticity, falling, discourse. Each of these is linked with others. For example, existence with understanding, projection, ability. One can see this becomes an exhaustive discussion of the structure of being, or of our being in the world. Now, Blattner wrote a book called Heidegger's Temporal Idealism, 1999. He's a professor at Georgetown currently, and he was Dreyfus's brilliant student. Dreyfus refers to him already in Lecture 1 and throughout the whole series, because he presents a problem for Heidegger and for Dreyfus that Dreyfus can't get his arms around. So for Blattner, care requires a special interpretation of the temporal structure of Dasein, indeed one that, quote, does violence, unquote, to our ordinary understanding of ourselves and our temporal structure. The future, present, and past into which Heidegger analyzes what he terms originary temporality are not successive. For Heidegger, if it were, care would be then grasped as an entity that runs its course in time. The being of an entity of the character of Dasein would then become something occurrent, like an object. An understanding of care demands that Dasein have a temporal structure, unlike anything we would expect, a non-successive manifold of future, present, past, almost like special relativity's block time. That is something most puzzling. This is the problem. For Heidegger, originary temporality is going to be the explanatory core of ordinary time, that is, world time. That is, it lies at the heart of world time. World time depends on originary temporality. World time is called time because it has features originary temporality explains. World time is the flow of time experienced by Dasein in an everyday way. World time is successive. Originary temporality is not. As Blattner says, world time is a sequence of qualitative or contentful moments or spans of time that Dasein encounters in its everyday going about its business. So we're back to the concept of moments again, which I criticized earlier. Heidegger cannot explain, cannot motivate the sequential nature of world time from originary temporality. Blattner provides a detailed analysis of why this is so. We need not go into it. The intuitive view is obvious. One cannot derive a sequence of nows, or for that matter, a flow, from a frozen static structure. Blattner declares Heidegger a temporal idealist. He is trying to derive the indivisible transformation of the universal field from the originary temporality, which is the structure of care, from Dasein, and he fails. Dreyfus is immensely frustrated by this. He keeps returning to the difficulty in lectures 5 through 10 in Division 2, hoping there is an escape. Quote from Dreyfus, Blattner says that Heidegger has to derive sequential order, the order of our practices, from original temporality. Can we get this world-coordinated activity structure, which is certainly a sequential structure, from this non-sequential structure, which is Dasein, a being that has to take a stand on its being? It can only take a stand on its being by activities towards role as temporality. Heidegger must show that the way our practice has to be, I have to type this out sequentially. The sequential structure itself flows from the kind of being we are. There might be something that doesn't depend on Dasein in nature, and that accounts for the fact that Dasein has to lay out its practices in sequential order in order to take a stand on itself. And you can't get sequence from the notion that we are a being taking a stand on being by way of those practices, which shows Heidegger is a realist. There is a constraint on those practices that comes from something like time, like nature time, some kind of sequencing that is not dependent on us. The way we take a stand on ourselves, put together with this constraint, say nature, would give us, say, the spanniness of world time, that is the sequence of the series of nows. Dreyfus contemplates how to reconcile our experience of nows with nature, the objective time of nature. Dreyfus knows the evolution of nature does not depend on us. Clearly it can't be dependent on us. The now must be relative to our project, he says. Sitting in this lecture, eating a hamburger. He can't imagine nature's now other than being the most infinitesimal of instants. But he can't make sense of before or after without a now in nature either. And, he notes, we would have to admit that Heidegger is a temporal idealist if nows are dependent on us, and if we could not make sense of a nature with its own independent nows. Then it would follow that there would not be any nature if we weren't around. So we're hoping that piano falling on the guy is not dependent on the guy sitting in the square there. That there are things happening in the external world independent of us. Or that the golf ball is slapping us, not because we generated it. The other way, if you could make a view of nature as some form of abstract ordering that didn't make any references to any of our purposes, and then didn't have a now in it, that would be an argument for realism. That gets us to the time-free movement of nature, where that means the movements in nature would still have a before and after, but they would not have our temporality, which is the earlier and the later. Now, I'm not dragging us through a long discussion on before and after versus earlier and later, because, frankly, I think it starts to get absurd. So he says, ultimately, of course, Heidegger failed. There has to be some natural constraint. the Titanic sinking up there is going to be a natural constraint on all the people on board. That orders our practices in a certain way. You can't cook steak, he says, before you kill the cow. And going on, Heidegger needs to explain the sequential nature of our practice. He wants to do it on the basis of our, Dasein's temporality. That is, as though it's coming from us solely. The whole world is coming from us. An idealist endeavor, and he cannot. In this he fails. And that's because there is something real out there he hasn't accounted for. I.e., the book is real and forces the page turning. Yes, this shades here of our discussion of number 21, not refuting the external world, the whole idealist endeavor, and the rather unbelievable difficulty it gets into. Dreyfus would rather say, give up on this goal and just admit Heidegger did a brilliant hermeneutic, phenomenological, existential analysis of the structure of our experience, provided you don't claim that it all depends on temporality. Still struggling with preserving a realism in Heidegger, as opposed to idealism, in the context in Dasein of a certain linking up with the world, and candidates for aspects of the world that can't be simply absorbed into activities of Dasein in idealistic fashion, so to speak, Dreyfus arrives at Gibson's affordances. I think he is getting at very, very deep and fundamental phenomena. And I think one of them is affordances, that there has to be solicitations in the world to which Dasein is responding in its activity. That would be way down at a kind of ontological level. In other words, at a level of physical reality. Again, in Gibson's framework, the medium has properties, qualities that afford stirring, the coffee medium. The cube affords grasping in its structure, or even throwing. And the table gradient there specifies that we can perhaps walk on it or slide on it. Again, underlying all these are invariant structures and invariance laws. Now I have to note at this point, our Mr. Bergson student, unable to cope with Heidegger's idealistic contradictions any longer, again passed out, never fully to recover. But we'll come back to this affordance question later. How might this dilemma relate to Heidegger's view of Bergson? Bergson merits a footnote in Division 2, Chapter 6, in Being and Time. After a bit of discussion of Bergson in relation to Hegel and Aristotle, and a strange description / distortion of Bergson's concept of time, which I won't go into. But by the way, I'm going to say, even in Blattner, I barely recognize his description of Bergson, his concept of time. If only going by it, I would never have bothered with Bergson. I won't go into it, but I think anyone who's watched my discussion of Bergson on time and then read Blattner's discussion in his Idealism book would not quite recognize what's going on, only partially. But in any case, going on with Heidegger, after this distortion, he says, well, it's not the place for analysis here. And then, still speaking of Bergson as part of then current theory, he says, so far as anything essential has been achieved in today's analyses, which includes Bergson's, which will take us beyond Aristotle and Kant, it pertains more to do with the way time is grasped and to our consciousness of time. So Heidegger appears to be only focused on time and free will. He's narrowed things down to just individual apprehension or perception of time or flow. Now, in my opinion, it's kind of myopic to construe time and free will so narrowly. But I can see how this could be a tendency, kinda. But one wonders, is there a work of Bergson that Heidegger did not read, or at least did not factor in? Well, it seems matter and memory, particularly Chapter 4. Here Bergson takes his whole conception of time to the universal level or scale. He lays out his 4 principles. Every movement is absolutely indivisible. There are real, not just relative movements. All division of matter into independent bodies is artificial. And real movement is the transference of a state, not of a thing. And, he says, rather than objects in relative motions, why not see the whole as changing indivisibly like a kaleidoscope? In other words, the whole field of matter, of the universe, globally is changing, and within it, then we partition objects and motions. This is Bergson's temporal metaphysic. It is a description of the external field with its extensity and its indivisible transformation, and in which Dasein is and has to be an integral participant. This is the view of the transformation of the universal field that Heidegger could have used, or maybe didn't accept. It would have resolved his inability to clearly break from idealism, and yet he would have kept the unity of subject and object that he wanted. And we'll return to this last, the subject-object point. Now, coffee stirring is a transformation within this indivisibly moving field, and the invariance laws defining it, the velocity flow fields, the adiabatic ratios, inertial tensors, tau ratios, all are the basis for affordances, for relating to the action systems, for perception as virtual action. We have the flow fields where the velocity vectors are proportional to 1 over the distance squared from the eye, ubiquitous fields, or the tau ratio defined over these fields, which are used to modulate landings. So this information in the external world, which is how we stir coffee, how we land, how we drive roads, is the source of the natural constraint on Dasein and his or her action. But we're back to the fundamental events of the world in which Dasein is engaged. Coffee stirring, hammering nails, driving to the store, shoveling snow, tummy sliding. In this basic experience, this ontology, Heidegger saw the fundamental basis of conceptual understanding. To quote, Heidegger regarded the understanding, as Kant examined it, to be a derivative human capacity, as Blattner notes. The ability to form and manipulate concepts, to arrange propositions logically. These are all achievements of the faculty of concepts, as Kant called it. They are important achievements, certainly, but they all rest on a basic familiarity with the world, as we have seen Heidegger argue. Now, this was not featured in Being and Time, but a subtheme. If the power of the intellect in the field of primary inquiry into the nothing and into being is shattered, then the destiny of the reign of logic in philosophy is thereby decided. The idea of logic itself disintegrates in the turbulence of a more originary questioning. So this took aim at predicate calculus and its well-formed formulae. Thus concepts, or as Kant identified them, predicates of possible judgments, are essential to the formation of thoughts and sentences that can succeed or fail in describing the world. Intentionality is ineliminably conceptual. This is the core commitment of the philosophical tradition that Heidegger rejects. Now, the analytic philosopher saw the threat. It was not received well. They needed to defend their predicate calculus, well-formed formulae, and logic. But Bergson, we saw, had developed this in a different way. The infinite is presented in an undifferentiated, transforming field in its global transformation. In this, our perception, for the sake of the body's action, must distinguish objects and motions, so we can grasp a bottle of milk, or seize a moving spoon, or for a panda, seize the milk. Now we've got to say goodbye to the dear pandas. The object is rarefied, this concept, ultimately to the continuum of spatial positions, with time just another dimension of this abstract space, the series of instants. So we have a four-dimensional space with one dimension meaning a set of discrete instants, and the other three a set of positions. And in this conception, where the bottle now moves from point to point across the continuum, or instant to instant, that motion is now completely relative. It becomes a rest depending on perspective. For given this mathematical treatment, a non-ontological treatment in effect, we can simply move the continuum beneath the object, or the object across the continuum. The difficulty, of course, is in the global transformation of the field, there's clearly simultaneity. There are organic motions, such as the growth of the rose, the growth of a tree, that cannot be relativized. One cannot relativize points, disparate points in that motion, and say they're non-simultaneous, either in the rose or the tree, without destroying the organic transformation that is in fact occurring. So there must be real motion. But this relative, discrete, point-to-point, instant-to-instant view is the classic metaphysic. This metaphysic underlies science. It underlies artificial intelligence. That is, the manipulation of abstract objects in an abstract space that also includes an abstract time, the time of instants, or states, states of the brain, states of the computer. For Bergson, this is the endpoint of a basic neural developmental trajectory of the brain, described in its stages by Piaget, with results that must be resisted, or at least consciously understood. Again, to Bergson, the task of physics and its discovery process is to penetrate beneath or through this projection frame of the classic metaphysic, this classic framework. And QM, for example, was one of the beginnings of this. But for Heidegger, this endpoint, this classic metaphysic endpoint, if you can even call it such in Heidegger's thought, was due to historical, societal causes. Again, this distinction, a thing merely present at hand, or a tool that is ready to hand. In the latter, like a hammer, you're not conscious of how that tool is performing its function. It is so integrated into the activity of hammering that it performs its function seamlessly. Only if the tool breaks down do you become aware of its structure, he says, that it's made up of various components. In that moment, the tool goes from something ready to hand for some activity to an object that is present at hand. He thinks this type of breakdown scenario, operating at a societal scale during the Renaissance, is what led to our objectification of the world in general. And as increasingly complex instruments were designed, where there is more of a possibility of a breakdown, and we need to reconstruct them in more complex ways, we begin to see the entire cosmos as machinery, a giant machine. I'm not a big fan of this historical thesis. That's partly my developing suspicion about the validity of many aspects of our received history, to include the nature of the Renaissance itself. Just for a start, one could look at Anatoly Fomenko's works, History, Fiction, or Science, 7 volumes. But way more so, I agree with Bergson. Arrival at the classic metaphysic is a natural developmental trajectory of the brain, body, mind, oriented as we are to action. And this natural developmental trajectory nevertheless still insists, along with Heidegger, that it's familiarity with basic events, that is, that the experience of the concrete world and its events is the basis for the abstract, that there is no abstraction without the concrete experience over which abstraction resides as an invariance. Or for Piaget's complex of concepts, causality, object, space, and time, the development of which we've looked at. But this is just way more differentiated and discussed development of the notion of the abstract, and even therefore the predicate calculus, ultimately than one would find in Heidegger. Further, Heidegger did not articulate the nature of this classic metaphysic, which underlies scientific thought and artificial intelligence in the way that Bergson did at all. I found this articulation extremely useful in trying to clarify the nature of the AI device, whose fundamental operations, its basic operational structure is embedded in the classic metaphysic, as opposed to a device that's integrally embedded in the temporal metaphysic. Just one example, the topic of how we perceive rotating cubes or stirring spoons or stirring fingers for that matter, and therefore the nature of a memory supporting this perception. For in the temporal metaphysic, one doesn't need short-term storage areas within the brain trying to store instant by instant these dynamic flows and then somehow reconstruct the motion of the event, which is just replete with logical contradictions. This is completely removed as a necessity in the temporal metaphysic. In any case, to the analytical philosophers, it didn't matter. Both Heidegger and Bergson were seen as threats, and both were attacked by the analytic philosophers. But this brings us to subject and object. As Blattner notes, if there is one consistent message throughout being and time, it is that the subject-object model of human experience, along with its attendant notions of inwardness and self-consciousness, must be discarded in favor of a model of human openness to a world that is always already there. I can't resist noting Blattner here, very Sartre's being and nothingness. Sartre insists that he is faithful to being and time in this subject-object orientation, but either he did not understand being and time, or he deliberately distorted it. So both Bergson and Heidegger had someone in common. You see my number 12, Sartre's fail on Bergson, namely Sartre the destroyer. Just a comment. But this brings us to subject and object, and the relation thereof. Heidegger's subject-object unity was a source of philosophical inspiration for the great pioneer AI researcher Terry Winograd in his break from internal symbol manipulating GoFi towards situated robotics. If one remembers, Winograd did a famous program called Sherdlu, 1972, and it dealt with manipulating a block world. For example, you can maybe read that. The human says, the blue pyramid is nice. I see blocks which are not red, but I don't like anything which supports a pyramid. Do I like the gray box? Or do I like anything in the gray box? And the machine answers, yes, two things, the blue block and the pyramid. So the machine figured that, well, I don't like red, but I must like blue. And Sherdlu was considered quite a marvel in natural language understanding relative to this tiny mini black world. So Winograd says, breaking from this whole AI notion, Heidegger makes a more radical critique, questioning the distinction between a conscious, reflective, knowing subject and a separable object. He sees representations as a derivative phenomenon, as Blattner noted, which only occurs when there is a breaking down of concernful action. Again, the breakdown of action. The machine breaks down. Knowledge lies in the being that situates us in the world, not in reflective representation. To me, this is the problem. How is that statement truly meaningful without Bergson's temporal metaphysic, explicitly laid out? And the body-brain is a reconstructive wave in the holographic field, specific to events within the field, and the subject-object related in terms of time. That is, without at least a framework of an alternative device. Then when we take the notion that representations, that is symbols, are derivatives of concernful action, we see everything is more concrete. In Bergson's model of perception, there are no internal symbols. There are no internal symbols for the blocks of the external microworld that Sherdlu is looking at. There are no internal symbols for the buzzing fly or the rotating cube. The symbols are the objects precisely where they are specified to be, externally in the flowing holographic field. Again, talking purely of perception, not thought. The symbols are the objects precisely where they are specified to be externally in the flowing holographic matter field. The symbols are the blocks right where they appear to be. The symbol is the fly, right where he is buzzing. The symbol is the cube, right where it is rotating, the coffee cup. What we normally term symbols, the symbols or images we use in representing the world, only arise when we have to go back into memory, when we have to redintegrate, when we have to recall an event or events, when we have to represent a piece of the world to ourselves via an image of memory. This representing state is now Heidegger's breakdown of concernful action, for we are now reflecting, not acting without representation on the concrete objects of the world, as when we are simply and naturally picking up the blocks, or reaching for the fly, or driving down the road, or just simply stirring the spoon, stirring the coffee. This is all leading to this fundamental difference between Bergson and Heidegger. Bergson was the exponent of time philosophy to the fact. Time and Free Will explored the findings of psychophysics. Matter and memory followed years of research on then current memory research, particularly amnesias, aphasias, recognition failures, dissociations, speech perception. Remember his thesis, whether experience is stored in the brain is absolutely critical to the problem of consciousness, which is to say, to the hard problem as well. And he left a model, an alternative model of the brain, memory, perception, cognition, in which the key is the union of subject and object in the holographic field. But Bergson had created a conception with solid points of anchor in science and for science. Gibson, for example, with his invariance laws defining events, and his notion of the brain is resonant to these laws, and therefore specific to the structure of the environment and the external environment, could be placed within Bergson's framework and made intelligible, and be tied to virtual action, direct specification, and even to direct memory, a piece of theory that Gibson in fact lacked. But Bergson's alternative, a brain acting as a modulated reconstructive wave within a holographic field, well, this cannot be so easily bulldozed under. It cannot be simply treated in Wiki as just another cyst swallowed by the AI amoeba. Unless you simply ignore it, again as I noted, refuse to look at it, or probably utterly misconstrue it, an alternative model as such can't be just shoved under the auspices of AI so easily. But this tie to science was not Heidegger's thing. He intended to analyze physics, but did not fulfill this. What he did do, this was sufficient for a Dreyfus to make a critique of AI, but Dreyfus had no alternative model to drive something beyond a critique. It had no model of perception. It is the origin of the image of the external world. Therefore, no model of retrieving experience. Therefore, of memory or cognition. Even Gibsonians, failing to incorporate Bergson, thus unclear on the origin of the image, the nature of specification, fail here on memory and cognition, not knowing what to do with it, not knowing what to do with inner images, representations of the world going on within, and becoming very AI-like because of this, as I've noted. And we've seen the resonance of this problem already in Heidegger. We go back to slide 43 in that statement. Discard inwardness. We have to discard inwardness and self-consciousness for a model that favors human openness to a world already there. Already we're seeing in Heidegger this same symptom of not knowing what to do with the internal world of representations. So yes, if we imagine down the road concrete attempts to implementing Bergson's framework as a brain being a support of a holographic reconstructive wave within a holographic field, I'm certain we'll find that many things are still insufficient. After all, we're only offering a schema, a framework here, much more to go. And yes, Heidegger's massive analysis of being may well hold fundamental keys for what being actually involves. But we have to start with a model of perception, the origin of the image of the external world. This drives a model of memory and cognition. Start at least here. But Heidegger gave us nothing on this. So we come to the throwdown. Who will be the judges? What shall be the criteria? Well, the criteria. Who gives science a model, a purchase into a non-mechanistic, non-AI model of mind? Who cannot simply be steamrolled by AI like Wiki did? Judges, I gave up on this. I think I'd get, whether living or dead, assigning thoughts to judges I think would be just getting me in trouble. So Bobby Flay is just going to be our generic cognitive scientist, someone who's interested in a model of the brain, cognition, memory, and perception. And in that case, the award is Best Cake, Dr. Bergson. Heidegger, we can give the runner-up award. And the rat, of course, Mr. Rat has to make a comment. He wants a real cake. So much could be compared. Just one thing. Look at the statement from Heidegger. In its practical being, any Dasein is as it already was, and is what it already was. It is its past, whether explicitly or not. But why not one step of abstraction more? Take Bergson, or the temporal metaphysic. This is just simply my paraphrase. Time should be viewed as a melody, for each note that is instant is the reflection of the entirety of the preceding notes. That is, the state of each note reflects the entire preceding series, where each note interpenetrates each other, forming an organic continuity. This latter statement is instantly applicable to AI and the problem of qualia. For example, mellow is a quality. We have mellow violins, mellow rooms, mellow wines. But this is a quality that can only exist by developing dynamically in this organic flow where each instant reflects the whole series. Mellow cannot exist as a static instant in an abstract series of discrete instants, that is, in an abstract time. It cannot be represented in a static data structure as above, with pointing to mellow violins, wines, personalities, rooms. And as we're speaking of being, we have, again, a mellow being, cat being quite mellow there, or a mellow personality. This alone destroys AI's pretension to simulating mind, because AI, the operative dynamics of AI, is the abstract space and abstract time of instance. But dig this out of Heidegger, out of that statement and those kinds of statements. I, for one, have seen no philosopher argue this simple point with respect to time and with respect to AI. It's already devastating, but clearly didn't come from Heidegger. For another part of the mellow picture and variance laws, take a look at a deep learning discussion on number 23 and slide 36. So much could be compared, even on Heidegger's core question, being. Because I'll tell you, for the Bergson student, senses that even here there is actually Bergson at the fundamental core. Something isn't right. And I thought perhaps someone has started to explore this. And a quick search, and I found this 2016 work by Heath Massey, The Origin of Time, Heidegger and Bergson. This is right here in Wisconsin, Beloit, University of Beloit. And from the description of the book, it says, until now, the question of Martin Heidegger's debt to Bergson has remained largely unanswered. Heidegger's brief discussion of Bergson and being and time is geared toward explaining why he fails in his attempts to think more radically about time. So why Bergson failed. Despite this dismissal, and it was a simple dismissal, a close look at Heidegger's early works dealing with temporality reveals a sustained engagement with Bergson's thought. Massey examines how Bergson's efforts to rethink time in terms of duration, or indivisible flow, anticipate Heidegger's own interpretation of temporality. He demonstrates how Heidegger follows Bergson in seeking to uncover primordial time by disengaging temporality from spatiality, that is, from the classic metaphysic, and how he associates Bergson with the tradition of philosophy that covers up this phenomenon, and how he overlooks Bergson's ontological turn in matter and memory, as I already noted. The application of his notion of time and free will, of duration, to the entirety of the universe, the universal field. Through close readings of early major works by both thinkers, Massey argues that Bergson is a much more radical thinker with respect to time than Heidegger allows. And frankly, I have to say, it's starting to look to me, as the more I look into this, that Heidegger is one of the guys with a shovel for Mr. Bergson. So my true postscript. Recently, I ran across a couple of Jeffrey Mishlev interviews on YouTube with Jason Reza Jorjani. One on Heidegger's Being and Time, one called The Spectral Revolution. In this latter, science would expand its model to the full range of human abilities, ESP, psychokinesis, precognition, etc. For Jorjani, Heidegger is the premier philosophical spearhead for this. And for both, Heidegger's Being and Time is, quote, the most revolutionary text of the 20th century. Now, Jorjani wrote a book in 2017 called Lovers of Sophia. And it says in the jacket, this cuts across the entire philosophical spectrum, featuring original interpretations of almost every canonical thinker in order to discover new concepts with the potential to catalyze scientific and political thought. Yes, exactly the criterion on which we judged. Difficulty, no Bergson, completely left out, no cake, nothing to judge there. This is unfortunate. Heidegger provides little basis for a new science, not even for the basis of everyday ecological perception, memory, and cognition. Yet Bergson not only offers a new model for this basic level, but as we have seen, clear indications of things beyond, a model of perception that is already Zen, changes of our scale of time, possible action in altered time, altered scales of time, access to the deep past, vast memory abilities, a non-mechanistic view of action, integral participation in the field that is already mind. So just saying, we need to rethink our evaluation. So down the road, still thinking of topics on this order: physics and the holographic principle, difficulties thereof, time travel, yes, no, partially, temporal consciousness, more on current memory research related to Bergson, the very origin of quanta and black body radiation in the photoelectric effect. Another one, quantum computing, shall we say myths versus realities. And again, as we're looking at AI, quantum computing usually sits as a threat from the AI community that will end the whole subject. So we should look into that perhaps, or something else. So next time we'll see. Till then, signing